History remembers the victors, but it rarely remembers those cast into the fire. Entire religions once flourished, whispering of light and shadow locked in eternal combat, only to be silenced, their scriptures burned, their gods reduced to footnotes or curses. These were the dualist faith traditions that dared to imagine a cosmos torn between forces of good and evil, spirit and matter, salvation and damnation. Their followers saw the world not as a harmonious creation but as a prison, a battlefield, where divine sparks struggled against chains of flesh. Yet today, their names are spoken only in fragments. Cathars, Manichaeans, Gnostics. Their sacred books lie scattered, their rituals extinguished, their gods exiled into myth. Why were these faiths erased so violently? What secrets did they guard that terrified empires and churches alike? And most haunting of all, if their gods were buried, are their echoes still alive within us? This is the secret history of dualist faiths and their vanished gods. From the beginning of human memory, myths of duality have haunted our imagination. They emerge in different lands, among different peoples, yet their pulse is strangely familiar. The universe itself is torn in two. For the dualist faiths, existence was not born from harmony, but from rupture, an ancient fracture that split light from darkness, truth from deception, spirit from flesh. Their stories are not gentle explanations of creation but stark dramas of conflict, where gods themselves wage endless war. Consider the cosmology of the Gnostics. In their vision, the material world was not a divine gift, but a trap. Above the heavens dwelt the ineffable God of light, unknowable and pure. Yet, from this perfection, a flawed being emerged, the demiurge, arrogant and blind. The demiurge shaped matter, imprisoning sparks of divine light within corrupt physical bodies. Humanity, they believed, carried those sparks, condemned to wander in ignorance unless awakened by secret knowledge or gnosis. The Gnostic myth was never simply about creation, it was about imprisonment, about the soul's desperate struggle to escape the counterfeit world and ascend back to its true source. But the Gnostics were not alone. Centuries earlier, in ancient Persia, Zoroastrianism envisioned existence as a battlefield between two primal forces, Ahura Mazda, Lord of Light and Truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of chaos and darkness. Unlike later monotheisms that insisted on one almighty creator, Zoroastrian dualism insisted that darkness was not an absence of good, but a power of its own, co-equal, terrible, and cunning. Every human choice, truth or lie, compassion or cruelty, became part of this cosmic war. The faithful believed their rituals and prayers tipped the balance of the universe itself. Then came the grand synthesis of Mahoni, the prophet of Manichaeism, who declared himself heir to Zoroaster, the Buddha, and Christ. Mahoni wove together strands of East and West into an immense myth of light scattered across the cosmos. He taught that particles of divine radiance had been stolen and trapped within matter, enslaved by the powers of darkness. The duty of the faithful was to free that light through ritual purity, ascetic discipline, and sacred knowledge, so that it could rise back to its eternal realm. For the Manichaeans, even the act of eating fruit became cosmic warfare. Consuming it properly could release the light locked inside. In medieval Europe, these ancient dualisms resurfaced in the Cathars. To Orthodox Christianity, the Cathars were heretics. To themselves, they were the pure ones. They believed the world was ruled not by the good God of the New Testament, but by a dark and false God, a demiurge of matter. Their true God was distant, dwelling in light beyond the stars. The soul's task was to reject the corrupt world, shun the trappings of flesh, and return to the divine. Cathar initiation, the consolamentum, was not merely a rite of passage, but an act of liberation, separating the spark from the prison of flesh. The common thread uniting these scattered traditions is the conviction that reality itself is divided and hostile. For dualist believers, life was not a gift to be celebrated, but evidence of captivity. Where other religions spoke of creation as a sacred act, dualist myths whispered of a crime. Where others praised obedience, dualists sought secret knowledge, hidden rituals, and inner awakening. Yet the stories were never only abstract metaphysics. They were vivid, even terrifying visions. Imagine a world where every sunrise was the eye of the enemy, where every pleasure was a chain, where every breath was a battle between powers vast beyond comprehension. These were not myths meant for comfort, they were meant to rattle, to awaken, to disturb the certainty of ordinary faith, and perhaps that is why they proved so dangerous. For if the world itself was evil, then kings and priests who ruled in its name were servants of darkness. If matter was a prison, then empire, wealth, and even the church could be unmasked as accomplices of the demiurge. To believe in dualism was to see the world upside down, to declare that what appeared holy might in fact be corrupted, and that salvation lay not in conformity, but in rebellion against the visible order. As we listen to these myths, they strike us as both alien and familiar. Alien, because they reject the comforting unity of one benevolent creator. Familiar, because echoes of their drama have never left us. Modern films, novels, and even conspiracies retell the same story. A hidden truth behind the surface world, a secret war of forces unseen, a spark of light trapped in a corrupt system. The dualist myth still whispers to us, even if its gods are forgotten. But to truly understand why these faiths arose, and why they terrified the powers of their day, we must leave the realm of myth and enter history itself. Behind the stories of imprisoned light and demiurges of darkness lie empires, persecutions, and vanished kingdoms. Their myths were not dreamed in isolation. They were born in the crucible of cultural conflict, written in fire and blood. To trace the roots of dualist faiths, we must leave behind the poetic visions of cosmic battles and step into the ruins of history. Here, the myths are tethered to real empires, real persecutions, and real communities that dared to hold beliefs branded as dangerous. Their stories are not only about theology, but about survival against overwhelming powers determined to erase them. The earliest seeds appear in ancient Persia, where Zoroastrianism flourished under the Achaemenid kings. Far from being a fringe heresy, it was once the state religion of vast empires, guiding rulers like Cyrus the Great and Darius. Its priests, the Magi, upheld a vision of the universe divided between truth and falsehood, light and darkness. For Persians, dualism was not only cosmic, it was political. The empire itself was framed as a bulwark of light against the chaos beyond its borders. When Alexander the Great swept through Persia, temples were desecrated and texts destroyed, but the ideas persisted. Even as empires rose and fell, the Zoroastrian vision of an eternal war echoed through later faiths by the first centuries of the Common Era. The Roman world was seething with spiritual diversity. Mystery cults, Jewish sects, early Christians, and Gnostics all contended for meaning. The Gnostics were not one movement, but many Valentinians, Sethians, and other groups, each reinterpreting the story of creation. Their enemies painted them as corruptors of the gospel, but in reality, they were attempting to grapple with a profound question. If God is good, why is the world so cruel? Their answer was radical: because the God who made it is not the highest God. Such ideas undermined the foundations of church authority, and for this, they were silenced. Much of what we know of them comes not from their own words, but from the hostile refutations of church fathers who condemned them. Then came Mani, born in 3rd century Mesopotamia, a visionary who proclaimed himself the final prophet. Mani sought to weave the truths of Zoroaster, Jesus, and the Buddha into a single faith. His religion, Manichaeism, spread with astonishing speed, stretching from the Roman Empire to China. For a time, it seemed unstoppable, a true world religion. Its missionaries carried scriptures filled with luminous imagery, hymns of imprisoned light, and ethical codes demanding strict asceticism. But its success made it dangerous. Roman emperors, Zoroastrian priests, and Christian bishops alike declared it a threat. To Christians, it was a heresy that distorted their message. To Zoroastrians, it was an intrusion upon their own traditions. To imperial powers, it was a rival allegiance. Thus, Manichaeans were hunted across continents, their scriptures destroyed, their communities driven underground. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, the spirit of dualism rose again. In the Languedoc region of southern France, the Cathars emerged, heirs to the same suspicion of the material world. Their faith flourished quietly in towns and villages, drawing followers who saw in their teachings an alternative to the wealth and corruption of the medieval church. To the Cathars, the visible church was compromised, perhaps even an instrument of the dark creator. Their own church was pure, rooted in simplicity and spiritual devotion. The consolamentum, their rite of initiation, offered not worldly belonging but liberation from the prison of flesh. For a time, the Cathars coexisted with local nobility, troubadours, and merchants in a flourishing culture. But their growing influence provoked Rome's fury. Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against them, the infamous Albigensian Crusade. Villages were burned, thousands massacred, and by the 14th century, Catharism was extinguished. Yet in their ashes, legends survived. Whispers of hidden treasures, secret rites, and truths that could not be killed. The story of dualist religions is not just one of belief, but of power. Each time these faiths arose, they were met with hostility from political and religious authorities. Why? Because dualism destabilized the very foundations of earthly order. If the material world was ruled by darkness, then kings, priests, and emperors who claimed divine sanction stood exposed as servants of the enemy. To follow dualism was to question everything, to live in defiance of empire and church alike. And yet, though their communities were destroyed, their gods were not wholly silenced. Fragments of their scriptures survived in desert caves, buried manuscripts, and accidental citations by their enemies. In these scraps, we glimpse the scale of what was lost. Whole worlds of myth, theology, and ritual burned, scattered, forgotten. What remains is enough to suggest a haunting paradox. These religions vanished in body, yet their souls endured. Their symbols and stories seeped into folklore, literature, and even the unconscious fabric of later faiths. Their kingdoms may be gone, but their memory refuses burial. From the rubble of vanished kingdoms, we turn now to their symbols, the enduring language of light and shadow that once bound their myths together. For even when texts were destroyed, symbols had the power to travel, to transform, and to outlast the empires that sought to erase them. When religions vanish, their stories may be silenced, but their symbols often endure. Symbols are stubborn things. They can survive persecution, travel across cultures, and slip into the unconscious even when their original context is forgotten. For the dualist faiths, symbols were not merely decoration, but the very language of their cosmology. They carried truths too dangerous to state, openly encoded in images of light and darkness, spirit and matter, ascent and fall. To understand dualism, we must walk into this symbolic twilight. Light was always more than physical radiance. In Zoroastrian hymns, light represented Usha truth, order, the divine force that resisted chaos. To the Gnostics, light was not simply illumination but the hidden essence of God, trapped in matter. To the Manichaeans, light was a tangible substance, broken into fragments and imprisoned in the physical world, waiting to be freed. In every case, light symbolized more than good, symbolized a lost home, a transcendent realm beyond the reach of corruption. Its counterpart, darkness, was equally vivid. In the myths of dualist religions, darkness was not merely the absence of light, but an active, hostile power. Angra Mainyu, in Zoroastrian belief, was a spirit of destruction and deceit, eternally opposed to Ahura Mazda. For the Gnostics, the demiurge was not evil in the cartoonish sense, but in the tragic one, a blind creator who mistook his prison for a paradise. For the Cathars, darkness was embedded in the material world itself, making the body a cage that trapped the divine spark. Darkness was heavy, binding, suffocating a reality that clung to the soul. But dualism did not rely only on this grand opposition. It encoded its worldview in subtler symbols. The serpent, for instance, shifts meaning depending on context. To Orthodox Christianity, it was Satan, the deceiver of Eden. But in some Gnostic traditions, the serpent was revered as the bringer of knowledge, the one who urged humanity to awaken from ignorance. Here we see dualism's challenge. What one faith calls evil, another may honor as liberating. The sun and the moon also carried layered meanings. The sun often symbolized the realm of divine light, eternal and unchanging, while the moon, with its cycles of waxing and waning, embodied the struggle between darkness and radiance. Some Manichaean hymns described the moon as a vessel that gathered fragments of light from the earth and carried them upward, like a cosmic fairy. What to most was a natural rhythm became, for them, a sacred process in the ongoing war of the cosmos. Even everyday elements carried weight. Fire was seen as a sacred purifier, capable of burning away the prison of matter. Water symbolized the boundary between realms, both life-giving and perilous. Food was not sustenance alone, but a container of light to be released through ritual. Consumption, every act, every object, could be a battlefield between opposing forces. Psychologically, these symbols resonate because they mirror inner experience. Carl Jung would later argue that light and darkness are archetypes within the collective unconscious, reflections of our own inner duality. To dream of light is to dream of awakening, transcendence, or reconciliation. To dream of darkness is to face fear, ignorance, or shadow aspects of the self. The dualist religions externalized what the psyche internalized, the struggle between awareness and blindness, freedom and bondage, wholeness and fragmentation. The universality of these archetypes becomes clear when we step outside the dualist faiths themselves. In Taoism, the yin-yang symbol encodes the dance of opposites, light and dark, male and female, heaven and earth, not as enemies but as complements. In Norse myth, the world is held between fire and ice, creation and destruction. In Hindu cosmology, the cycles of creation and dissolution are endless, a rhythm of opposites entwined. Across the world, the human imagination seems compelled to frame existence in polarities. What makes the dualist religions unique is their insistence that these polarities are not balanced but fundamentally hostile, that the war between them is absolute. Contrast lies at the heart of dualist symbolism, where orthodox Christianity saw creation as good, dualists saw it as flawed. Where empire praised the stability of order, dualists exposed it as a mask for oppression. Where common folklore feared the serpent, dualists sometimes honored it as liberator. Their symbols unsettled because they inverted expectations, turning the familiar into the forbidden. Yet this symbolic inversion gave their faiths extraordinary power. A follower could look at the night sky and see not stars but fragments of divine light imprisoned in darkness. A loaf of bread was not mere food but a cosmic vessel. A ritual was not empty performance but participation in a war older than the world. Symbols transformed existence into myth, making every moment matter. But symbols were also dangerous. To outsiders, dualist imagery could look like blasphemy. To call the creator of the world a demiurge was to accuse the very fabric of reality of deception. To honor knowledge brought by the serpent was to invert Eden itself. This was more than theology, was cultural rebellion, a refusal to accept the given order of things, and that, perhaps, is why these symbols could not be tolerated. They were hunted, distorted, condemned. But symbols, unlike temples, cannot be destroyed so easily. They slip into new contexts, mutate, and reappear. Even today, we use the language of light and darkness to describe moral struggles, personal awakenings, and political conflicts. When we speak of illuminating the truth or battling our inner demons, we echo dualist archetypes without realizing it. Thus, the symbols outlived the kingdoms. The religions may have perished under fire and sword, but their symbolic vocabulary endured, whispering across centuries in art, literature, and psychology. From symbols, we must turn to practices, to the forbidden rituals that gave these symbols life in flesh and blood. For dualist faiths were never only about cosmic stories or abstract images. They were embodied in ceremonies performed in secret, rites that promised to free the spark of light from its prison. These rituals, hidden and condemned, would become the beating heart of dualist mystery and the reason they were feared by their enemies. Stories and symbols were powerful, but they were not enough. For the followers of dualist faiths, belief alone could not liberate the soul from the prison of matter. Knowledge had to be embodied, and symbols had to be enacted. This is where their secret rituals emerged, hidden practices that transformed cosmic myths into lived reality. To their enemies, these rites were whispered about as heretical, perverse, or even satanic. To their practitioners, they were sacred, keys to freedom. Among the Gnostics, initiation was often tied to the transmission of secret knowledge, known as gnosis. This was not knowledge in the academic sense, but a living revelation, often conferred through ritual. Some texts describe elaborate baptisms, not only in water but in light and fire, intended to awaken the divine spark within. In the Gospel of Philip, we find hints of bridal chamber ceremonies, mystical unions that symbolized the reconciliation of divided realities. To outsiders, such rites were scandalous or incomprehensible. To initiates, they were pathways to transcendence. The Manichaeans took ritual discipline to extremes. Their community was divided between the elect and the hearers. The elect lived under strict ascetic vows. They abstained from meat, sex, and worldly wealth, believing such attachments deepened the entrapment of light in matter. Their daily rituals included prayers facing the sun and moon, celestial bodies thought to gather fragments of divine radiance, Even eating became a sacred act. Fruit and vegetables, believed to contain particles of imprisoned light, were consumed with prayers designed to release that light. In this way, a simple meal became cosmic warfare, a sacrament of liberation. Meanwhile, the hearers lived less stringently, supporting the elect by providing food and shelter. Yet even they participated in the ritual economy of light, their offerings, enabling the elect to maintain their purity. This tutored system reflected the dualist worldview. Some bore the burden of earthly necessity, while others sought radical liberation. Together, they formed a community bound by ritualized resistance to the powers of darkness. In medieval Languedoc, the Cathars enacted their defiance through the consolamentum. This was no ordinary baptism, but a once-in-a-lifetime initiation that marked the believer's passage from the material world to the realm of spirit. Administered by laying on of hands, the ritual was believed to cleanse the soul of the corruption of matter. Those who received it were called the perfect, men and women who renounced marriage, meat, and the pleasures of the flesh. For them, the consolamentum was not merely symbolic. It was a radical break from the world, a direct rejection of the demiurge's domain. So feared was this ritual that inquisitors targeted it with particular ferocity. To the Catholic Church, the consolamentum mocked the sacraments, creating a rival priesthood of heretics who rejected the visible church. To the Cathars, it was the one sacrament that mattered, a lifeline to the true God of light. Stories abound of dying believers begging to receive the consolamentum on their deathbeds, clinging to the hope of release from the cycle of imprisonment. Even beyond formal ceremonies, dualist practices carried an aura of secrecy. Meetings were often held in private, at night, or in hidden rooms. Scriptures were read only to initiates. Oral transmission was emphasized, as written texts could be confiscated or burned. This secrecy bred suspicion, giving rise to rumors that the sects practiced sorcery, orgies, or cannibalism. In truth, their rituals were usually ascetic and restrained, but in the imagination of their enemies, secrecy itself became proof of wickedness. The contrast is striking. On one hand, the rituals of dualist faiths were acts of devotion, attempts to embody their mythic vision of light's liberation. On the other, they were interpreted as threats, subversions of social and religious order. This tension between inner truth and outer persecution defined their existence. And yet, secrecy was also their strength. It allowed their traditions to survive longer than expected. Passed quietly from teacher to disciple, from community to community, rituals became not only religious acts but acts of resistance. To kneel in prayer before the moon, to renounce the world through the consolamentum, to eat fruit as a sacrament of liberation. These were ways of defying the powers that sought to silence them. But secrecy had its cost, because their practices were rarely written down in detail. Much of what we know comes from hostile sources: church fathers, inquisitors, imperial edicts. These descriptions often exaggerate or distort, making it difficult to separate truth from propaganda. Were Gnostic bridal chambers, mystical allegories, or literal rites? Did the Cathars truly reject all sacraments but one? Did Manichaean ascetics actually believe they were digesting the light of the cosmos? With every account, we face the shadow of uncertainty. What remains clear is this: rituals were the lifeblood of dualist communities. They were the way myths became flesh, the bridge between cosmic stories and daily life. Without them, the faiths could not survive. With them, they inspired both deep devotion and violent repression, and it was repression, above all, that shaped their fate. For their enemies, the very existence of forbidden rituals was intolerable. Fire and sword were unleashed, not only to kill bodies but to erase practices, to sever the chain of transmission that carried these mysteries forward. Yet even destruction could not silence the debates. Across centuries, scholars, theologians, and historians have wrestled with the question: what was truth, and what was slander? Were the forbidden rites of dualist sects genuine doorways to transcendence, or simply the fantasies of persecutors? It is to those debates and controversies that we now turn, as we sift through the ashes of accusation to search for fragments of forgotten truth. When the rituals of dualist sects faded into smoke and ash, they left behind more questions than answers. What really happened in their hidden chambers? Were their practices as subversive as their enemies claimed, or have centuries of polemic distorted them beyond recognition? The problem is that nearly all we know of these faiths comes not from their own voices, but from the pens of those who condemned them. To approach the truth, we must wade through layers of accusation, fear, and propaganda. Take the Gnostics. Most of their texts were destroyed after the rise of orthodoxy in the Roman Empire. What little we knew of them for centuries came from writers like Irenaeus, who described their beliefs in order to refute them. He painted them as arrogant, immoral, and dangerously seductive. Yet the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945 changed everything. Suddenly, authentic Gnostic writings resurfaced Gospels of Thomas, Philip, and Mary that revealed a faith far more nuanced and profound than hostile accounts suggested. Instead of chaos, there was philosophy. Instead of debauchery, there was mystical longing. The gap between accusation and reality could not have been starker. The Manichaeans suffered similar distortions. Imperial edicts called them sorcerers, enemies of order, and corruptors of morals. Augustine of Hippo, who had once been a Manichaean follower before converting to Christianity, later became one of their fiercest critics. Some scholars argue that movements like the Cathars were never as organized as inquisitors claimed, that the image of a vast church of heresy was exaggerated to fuel crusades. Others maintain that dualist ideas were indeed widespread, challenging the church not just theologically but politically. The truth likely lies between fragmented communities, bound by shared symbols, magnified into monstrous conspiracies by fearful rulers. Even today, debates continue. Were the Gnostic Gospels legitimate alternatives to the New Testament, or esoteric offshoots never meant for wide audiences? Was Mani a prophet of universal religion, or an opportunistic syncretist borrowing from every tradition he encountered? Were Cathar rites a continuation of ancient dualism, or a medieval reinvention colored by local conditions? Every answer is contested, every interpretation shadowed by uncertainty. What is undeniable is the violence with which these faiths were suppressed. Inquisitions, burnings, and edicts were not aimed merely at eradicating heresy, but at erasing memory itself. When texts were destroyed, when initiates were silent, accused them of absurd cosmologies, of worshipping the sun and moon, and of being enslaved to bizarre dietary restrictions. But Augustine's polemics were colored by his personal need to distance himself from his past. For centuries, his words shaped the Western understanding of Manichaeism until archaeological finds in Central Asia unearthed fragments of their scriptures. These revealed a system not of nonsense but of remarkable sophistication, blending art, ethics, and cosmology into a coherent whole. The Cathars, too, were maligned by their persecutors. The Inquisition described them as devil worshippers, destroyers of families, and deniers of Christ. They were accused of obscene ceremonies, of spitting on crosses, of practicing dark magic. But when we look at the surviving testimonies of Catholic believers often extracted under torture, what emerges is very different. Their faith emphasized simplicity, humility, and a radical rejection of worldly corruption. Far from practicing orgies or sorcery, they lived austere lives, refusing violence and wealth. The contrast between their ideals and the savagery of the crusade launched against them reveals a chilling irony. Those branded as enemies of Christ often embodied a gentler vision of his teachings than their accusers. The controversies surrounding dualist religions extend beyond theology into the realm of historical interpretation. Were they truly widespread and threatening, or were they magnified by authorities seeking justification for repression? CED, when communities were scattered, what remained was a void that enemies filled with their own narratives. The bonfire became a weapon not just of destruction but of historical control. And yet, even in controversy, fragments of truth survive. The discovery of buried manuscripts, the preservation of oral traditions, the persistence of these suggest that the story was never fully silenced. What was painted as heresy may in fact have been a profound spiritual alternative, one that threatened entrenched power precisely because it inverted the accepted order of the world. The controversies matter because they force us to confront a deeper question: who controls history? Is it written by those who lived the faith, or by those who destroyed it? In the case of dualist religions, the answer is clear: the victors told the story, and the vanquished were reduced to whispers. But whispers can be powerful. They stir curiosity, provoke doubt, and inspire new searches for hidden truths. As we sift through ashes, what we find is not certainty, but tension. Myth versus slander, faith versus fear, memory versus erasure. This tension is precisely what has allowed dualist religions to haunt the imagination for centuries. They may be gone, but the debates about them keep their shadows alive. From these debates, we turn next to their echoes. For while inquisitors silenced their voices, their symbols and myths slipped into folklore, literature, and cultural memory. The dualist faiths may have been silenced by fire, but their stories survived in disguise in the songs of troubadours, the tales of peasants, and the alchemical manuscripts of wandering sages. When fire consumed the scriptures of the Cathars, when inquisitors silenced the voices of Gnostic teachers, and when Manichaean missionaries were hunted across continents, it might have seemed the story of dualist religions had ended. Yet myths are not so easily killed. They slip into other forms: songs, fables, symbols, whispered stories told by peasants in fields or scribes in dimly lit rooms. The faiths themselves may have perished, but their echoes lived on, woven into folklore, art, and cultural memory. In medieval Europe, the Cathars left behind no cathedrals, no grand libraries of doctrine. What endured, instead, was legend. Troubadours in southern France carried songs that hinted at secret truths, often cloaking Cathar ideals in the language of courtly love. On the surface, these poems celebrated romance, but beneath them, scholars detect allegories of spiritual longing, the soul's yearning to reunite with the divine light beyond the prison of flesh. The imagery of forbidden love became a poetic disguise for forbidden faith. Fairy tales, too, bear traces of dualist thought. Consider stories in which the hero or heroine is trapped in an enchanted prison, awaiting rescue or awakening, or tales where light is stolen by a monster and must be reclaimed. These motifs, common across Europe, resonate with the dualist vision of sparks imprisoned in matter. The narratives may have lost their explicit theology, but the symbolic bones remained intact, re-emerging in folktales told to children at hearth fires. Alchemy, that mysterious blend of science, mysticism, and art, also carried echoes of dualist imagery. Many alchemical texts speak of the transformation of base matter into gold as a metaphor for spiritual liberation, the freeing of the divine essence from its material prison. Symbols of the sun and moon, of fire purifying the impure, aligned closely with Manichaean cosmology, whether directly inherited or indirectly absorbed. The alchemist's quest mirrored the dualist hope of releasing light from darkness. Even Christian mysticism shows traces of what orthodoxy once condemned. Some medieval visionaries wrote of experiences of ascent beyond the material realm, of encounters with a god utterly beyond the world of flesh. Though couched in Christian language, their visions often echoed Gnostic yearnings. The line between orthodoxy and heresy was never as sharp as inquisitors wished. Within convents and monasteries, the same longings that once animated dualist sects found new expression. Hidden beneath the cloak of accepted faith, legends of lost treasures and hidden books also preserved fragments of memory. In the Languedoc, whispers endured of Cathar secrets hidden in mountain fortresses, treasures spirited away before the Crusaders could seize them. Some believed these treasures were not gold or jewels, but manuscripts, gospels that revealed truths the Church sought to bury. Whether true or not, the legends kept alive the sense that something precious had been stolen from history, something still waiting to be rediscovered. Outside Europe, dualist echoes took different forms. In Central Asia, fragments of Manichaean manuscripts and arts survived long after the religion itself was eradicated. Their images of radiant beings, cosmic battles, and imprisoned light found their way into Buddhist art and local folklore. In China, where Manichaeism mingled with Taoist and Buddhist traditions, traces of its dualist cosmology persisted in sectarian movements for centuries. The faith may have died as an institution, but its symbolic DNA was absorbed into the cultural body of entire regions. What is most striking is the persistence of inversion motifs in folklore. The idea that the visible world is false, that rulers are liars, that salvation lies in hidden knowledge. Peasant tales of trickster figures who expose corrupt kings, or of secret doors leading to otherworldly realms, echo the same suspicion of appearances that define Gnosticism and Catharism. Folklore became a vessel for the forbidden imagination, carrying dangerous ideas disguised as harmless entertainment. Even architecture bears faint echoes. Some scholars point to unusual symbols carved into rural churches in southern France, crosses turned askew, suns and moons placed in opposition as possible traces of Cathar sympathizers who left their mark in stone. Whether intentional or coincidental, these anomalies fuel the belief that dualist myths left secret signatures across the cultural landscape. The persistence of these echoes raises an unsettling question. If the myths survived in disguise, did they ever truly vanish? Perhaps they continued to shape imagination long after the sects were destroyed, influencing movements as diverse as Renaissance humanism, Romantic poetry, and modern esotericism. Each revival may not have been a conscious resurrection of dualism, but a reawakening of its archetype symbols too deeply embedded in the human psyche to be erased. Thus, the story of dualist religions did not end with their suppression. It transformed from sect to song, from scripture to story, from ritual to folktale. Their vision of light against darkness endured in whispers and images. They became ghosts in the cultural machine, never fully present, never fully gone. And these echoes did more than preserve memory. They prepared the ground for modern when scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries rediscovered Gnostic texts or studied Cathar legends, they were not starting from nothing. They were awakening fragments already alive in folklore and imagination. The myths had survived, waiting to be recognized. From folklore, we now turn to the present to examine how dualist myths have not only survived in disguise, but continue to haunt modern culture. For even in our supposedly secular age, the battle of light and darkness, truth and deception, still defines our stories, our fears, and our search for meaning. Though centuries have passed since the Cathar fortresses burned, since scriptures were torn apart, and since Gnostic teachers were silenced, the worldview they carried did not vanish. Instead, it slipped into new forms, reshaping itself within the cultural imagination. Even today, echoes of dualism resound in the stories we tell, the fears we nurture, and the frameworks we use to understand the world. Modernity, for all its science and skepticism, has never escaped the gravitational pull of light and darkness. Look first at popular culture. The very structure of countless films and novels hinges on dualist tropes, hidden realities, cosmic battles, and heroes awakening to truths concealed from ordinary eyes. Consider the endless fascination with dystopias, where corrupt systems conceal deeper truths, or with science fiction tales like The Matrix, which explicitly borrowed from Gnostic thought. In these narratives, the world presented to us is an illusion, a prison crafted by powers that feed on human ignorance. Salvation comes only when the protagonist awakens to the hidden structure of reality. This is dualism reborn in cinema, served not as theology but as entertainment, yet still carrying the same emotional charge. Superhero myths also echo the cosmic battle between light and dark. Figures like Batman, fighting in the shadows against a city steeped in corruption, or Superman, a radiant savior from the skies, embody archetypes of dualist tension. These modern myths may wear the garb of capes and costumes, but beneath them is the ancient drama of imprisoned light and oppressive darkness. Beyond fiction, we see dualism in modern spirituality. The New Age movement, with its emphasis on hidden truths, spiritual awakening, and the rejection of materialism, draws heavily on Gnostic currents. Concepts of higher self versus ego, or of lightworkers battling against dark energies, resonate with the ancient myth of divine sparks trapped in matter. Though often stripped of their historical context, these ideas show how the dualist imagination remains alive, reinterpreted for contemporary seekers. Even conspiracy theories, strange as it may seem, carry the DNA of dualism, the conviction that hidden elites control the world, deceiving the masses with false appearances, mirrors the Gnostic suspicion of the demiurge and his archons. For conspiracy believers, the visible order governments, corporations, media, but a facade hiding darker forces. Liberation comes not through faith but through secret knowledge, available only to the awakened few. What once was a spiritual cosmology has re-emerged as political paranoia. Psychologically, dualism thrives in the way we frame our inner lives. We still speak of battling our inner demons, of seeking the light within, of resisting temptations of the flesh. Modern psychology might rephrase these struggles as conflicts between conscious and unconscious, between impulse and reason, between shadow and persona. Yet the symbolic language remains dualist at its core. The self is divided, and healing requires reconciliation or transcendence. Carl Jung's theory of the shadow echoes this dynamic perfectly. To integrate the shadow is to reclaim the parts of ourselves imprisoned in darkness, a process eerily similar to the Gnostic liberation of divine sparks. The political realm, too, is steeped in dualist rhetoric. Leaders and movements frame conflicts as ultimate battles of good versus evil, civilization versus barbarism, freedom versus tyranny. Nuance and complexity are stripped away in favor of stark polarity. Though secular in form, this rhetoric mirrors the cosmic absolutism of dualist religions. It transforms political struggles into moral crusades, echoing the apocalyptic urgency of ancient faiths. Even science, often seen as the antithesis of myth, carries subtle dualist undertones. The language of physics describes matter and antimatter, order and entropy, light and shadow. While these are neutral phenomena, they resonate symbolically with archetypal polarities. In environmental debates, we frame humanity as locked in battle against planetary destruction, casting ourselves as liberators of life from the encroaching darkness of collapse. The imagery is modern, but the structure is ancient. What is striking is not only the persistence of dualism, but its adaptability. Where ancient Gnostics whispered of archons and demiurges, modern skeptics speak of systems and structures. Where Cathars saw the church as the agent of darkness, today's critics see corporations or governments. The enemy changes form, but the suspicion remains that the world is not what it seems, that appearances deceive, that truth is hidden and must be sought by the few willing to awaken. This persistence raises profound questions. Why does dualism continue to enchant us? Perhaps because it gives structure to our deepest anxieties, the feeling of being trapped in a world beyond our control, of sensing hidden forces shaping our fate, of longing for a reality beyond the visible. These are timeless experiences. Dualism provides a story that makes sense of them, a mythic map of fear and hope. And yet, dualism is not merely consoling. Its stark divisions can also fuel fanaticism. To believe utterly in the war of light and darkness is to risk dehumanizing opponents, seeing them not as flawed humans, but as agents of evil. Here lies the double edge. The same myth that awakens can also destroy. The Cathars sought purity and peace, yet their opponents cast them as demonic. Modern conspiracy theorists may feel empowered by hidden knowledge, yet their convictions can spiral into paranoia and violence. Thus, modern parallels remind us that dualism is not only a relic of the past, but a living force, shaping stories, beliefs, and conflicts. It haunts our art, our politics, our spirituality, and our psychology. We are still, in many ways, Gnostics without knowing it, heirs to vanished gods whose voices echo in new forms. But to grasp the deepest reason for this endurance, we must turn inward. For dualism is not only a story about the cosmos, it is a story about the soul. Its enduring power lies in its ability to mirror our inner divisions, our longing for wholeness, our fear of corruption, and our hope for transcendence. To see why dualism refuses to die, we must step into psychology and philosophy, where the myths of light and darkness become metaphors for the human condition itself. Word count, 900. Would you like me to move on to section 9? The soul's dilemma. Psychological and philosophical meaning, 900 words. You said, yes, ChatGPT said. The soul's dilemma. Psychological and philosophical meaning. If dualist religions survive today, in whispers, symbols, and modern parallels, it is not only because of cultural memory, it is because they speak to something fundamental in the human psyche. Their myths of light and darkness are more than stories about gods and demons. They are mirrors reflecting our own inner struggles. Psychology and philosophy allow us to see these faiths not only as historical curiosities, but as profound attempts to articulate the dilemma of the soul. Carl Jung argued that humanity carries within it archetypes, universal patterns embedded in the collective unconscious. Among the most powerful of these is the polarity of light and shadow. To Jung, the shadow represented the repressed, denied aspects of the self, while light symbolized consciousness and integration. Gnostic myths of sparks trapped in matter, or Cathar visions of souls imprisoned in flesh, echo this inner reality. They dramatize what we all feel, that there is more within us than what we see, that parts of our being are hidden, even captive. The liberation sought by dualist sects parallels the psychological journey of confronting and integrating the shadow. But the dualist imagination does more than mirror, provides language for existential tension. Think of the human experience. We long for transcendence, yet we are bound by our bodies. We strive for purity, yet we are haunted by impulses we cannot control. We seek truth, yet we live in a world of illusion and manipulation. Dualism externalizes this inner fracture, giving it cosmic form. the demiurge becomes the face of our limitations, while the god of light embodies our yearning for perfection. Philosophers, too, have wrestled with this dilemma. Plato's allegory of the cave, though not dualist in theology, frames reality as shadows on a wall concealing a higher truth. For centuries, thinkers have debated whether the world we see is real or a veil. Gnostic and Manichaean myths take this suspicion to its radical conclusion. The world is not just imperfect, but fundamentally flawed, the work of a power opposed to the good. In this way, dualism becomes not only theology, but philosophy in mythic clothing, asking the most unsettling question of all: can we trust reality itself? This question has never lost its power. René Descartes, centuries later, posed a version of it when he asked whether a malicious demon might be deceiving us, making all our perceptions false. Modern philosophy and science pose similar dilemmas. Are we living in a simulation, victims of illusions generated by unseen systems? These are contemporary restatements of ancient dualist suspicion. The myth of the demiurge lives on in silicon and theory, reappearing as speculation about virtual realities and artificial intelligences. But psychology offers another reading. Where dualist religions often sought escape from the world, Jung urged reconciliation. He saw the integration of light and shadow, not as a cosmic war to be won, but as a path toward wholeness. To him, denying the material, the flesh, or the unconscious leads to fragmentation. In contrast, the task of the soul is to embrace both light and darkness, to recognize the necessity of opposites. Here lies a profound contrast. Where the Cathars renounced the world, modern psychology seeks to reintegrate it. Yet even in this contrast, we can feel the resonance. Dualist myths express the pain of division. Psychology reframes it as an opportunity for growth. Both acknowledge the same truth. Human beings are torn between impulses, ideals, and realities. The language differs, but the struggle is the same. Philosophically, dualism also raises ethical dilemmas. If matter is evil, then what value has compassion, creativity, or love within the world? If the body is a prison, then is the care of others meaningless? The harsh asceticism of the Manichaean elect, or the Cathar perfecti, reflected this tension. They chose purity over participation, transcendence over attachment. To their critics, this was nihilistic. To them, it was liberation. The philosophical weight of such choices still confronts us. Do we embrace the world despite its flaws, or renounce it in pursuit of a higher ideal? Modern existentialism echoes this tension. Thinkers like Sartre and Camus grappled with the absurdity of existence, the sense that life is fundamentally flawed or meaningless. Camus' response was not dualist rejection, but defiant embrace. Embrace imagine, Sisyphus, happy, even as he pushes his stone. Yet the question that animated Gnostics and Cathars remains: how do we live in a world that seems hostile to spirit? Do we rebel, escape, or transform it from within? This is why the psychological and philosophical meaning of dualism endures. It does not matter whether the demiurge ever existed, or whether sparks of light truly dwell in matter. What matters is that these myths give form to the experience of alienation, of longing, of inner division. They speak to the soul's dilemma. To be human is to feel trapped between worlds, yearning for what lies beyond, yet bound to what lies here. Perhaps this is why dualist faiths were destroyed so violently. Their myths were dangerous not only politically, but they suggested that the order of things, the church, the empire, the body, the world itself, was not trustworthy. They offered liberation, but at the cost of rejecting everything society held sacred. To embrace them was to risk tearing reality apart, and yet, their philosophical weight remains with us. Whenever we question appearances, whenever we sense that truth lies hidden, whenever we wrestle with inner shadows, we walk in their footsteps. They are gone, but their dilemma is our dilemma. From here, the story draws to a close. For having traced the myths, the histories, the symbols, the rituals, the debates, the echoes, and the modern parallels, we arrive at a final reflection. What remains of these vanished gods? Are they truly dead, or do they still breathe beneath the ashes of memory, waiting for us to listen? The flames that consumed the Cathar fortresses, the decrees that silenced the Manichaeans, the denunciations that buried the Gnostic soul were meant to erase, yet erasure is never complete. Beneath the ash of history, the gods of dualist faiths still breathe. They no longer reign in temples or guide empires, but they live in the symbols that haunt our imagination, in the stories that frame our conflicts, in the restless suspicion that reality itself may be flawed. To walk through their history is to confront both horror and wonder. Horror at the violence of suppression, wonder at the endurance of ideas too deep to destroy. These vanished gods remind us that truth is never singular, that light and shadow are forever entwined, and that every attempt to silence the forbidden only drives it deeper into memory. The dualist faiths may be gone, but their myths remain alive in Usan, our dreams, our art, our philosophies, our very language of light and dark, and perhaps that is their secret victory. Though silenced by fire, they continued to whisper, calling us to question, to awaken, to seek the hidden beyond the seen.